Okay, so I'm Jean-Claude Bergerman. I hope you are still with us because we had some technical problems to get this up and running. As the chief executive of Ford used to say in a debate with Bill Gates, if a car would run like your software runs, we would have a lot of problems. This being said, I promise you will be compensated for your patience because we have a very interesting session before us. The session we have called Does Good Science Lead to Good Advice and Policy Making? And we will explore in the remaining time the links between science, science advice, and evidence-based policy making. I'm an academic now at the University of Brussels. I used to work in policy advice at the European Commission, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Frontiers Policy Labs, the open access editor with whom we are setting up this project. Next slide, please. Last year, when the COVID crisis hit us, people from Frontiers and the Frontiers Policy Labs to create this initiative, which was actually meant to try to find better ways to communicate science and better ways to make sure that good science has an impact. And that was, of course, related to the lessons we learned from the uptake of COVID, the uptake of the vaccine development, and so on. We wanted to have discussions and provocative opinions about how to bridge what was apparently a gap between science and policy, and which became very acute under COVID, but which we have witnessed many times. I myself, being at the European Commission, being quite close to some of the decision-making points of the European Commission, I've saw many times that there was not per se a lack of science, not per se a lack of science communicators, but there was quite often a complete mismatch between what we needed at the right moment and at the right time. So that was actually the core of our concern and the starting point. We talked to experts from policy, business, and academia about what they see as lessons learned from the COVID experience, the COVID pandemic, and what needs to be done and to change, in particular in science and in science policy, to avoid that the next pandemic, from whatever nature, would again take us by surprise, and that the next challenges ahead, like climate change, for example, we would be much more efficiently be dealing with and effectively. The response to all this was quite tremendous. We almost never had to do an effort to get people to speak to us and to reflect on this, and so we were able to present and to talk to a quite experienced group of high-level experts for their opinions. Next slide, please. The mission then of the Policy Labs, it was the previous slide. The mission then of the Policy Labs remains to explore these ways to bridge science policy gap, to experiment with various formats for the science policy interface, and to promote a culture of evidence-based decision-making. So anyone who wants to work with us on that or who has ideas, please contact us. Next slide, please. And I assume most of you know Peter Gluckman, who is now the president of the International Science Council and the former chief scientific advisor of the President. He was one of our first conversation partners, and there you see one of his endorsements. Next slide, please. In terms of impact, attention impact to put it, you see the figures, they speak for themselves. I will not go over it for the sake of time, but you can see that, and I must say, what we expected, we did not expect it to take off that fast and that high. You can see that the impact in terms of attention was quite well developed. So we are very happy with that result. Next slide, please. So Professor Caroline Wagner is a member of our editorial advisory board, and earlier this year, under her leadership, we started the Project Hope as part of the Policy Labs. It's a unique project because it looks at science policy from the receiver's end, so to speak. I mean, how will policymakers perceive and receive science and science advice, not from the senders, and how do scientists communicate? And in this session, we will precisely focus on that and discuss the preliminary results of this Project Hope with a wonderful panel and I hope a wonderful audience. So we are honored to have with us today the 4 panelists. You see them there on the right-hand side. Professor Mamoketi Faiken from University of Cape Town, Professor Ruth Morgan from UCL, Professor Amy Queron from your part of the world, from the Chief Scientist of Quebec, and then finally, of course, as I mentioned, Professor Caroline Warner, who is the lead person of this project. So it is now my pleasure, and for the sake of time, I hand it immediately over to introduce Caroline and to ask her to take the floor.
Great. Thank you so much, JC. It's just been a pleasure and an honor to work with you on this project, hearing our policymakers' experiences. I also want to thank the team that's been very wonderful in putting all of this together. Natalia Marcheska, Stefan Koster, and George Thomas have all worked very hard on this to put together our presentation today and also all of our interviews. The idea of the hearing our policymakers' experiences is to find out what is the most effective and efficient way in which our policymakers receive scientific information. We know that Frontiers has a wonderful platform with hundreds of journals. I edit a journal called Research Policy and Strategic Management on Frontiers. And in addition, we seek to work through a larger journal. We are part of a larger journal on research metrics that's edited by Professor Chao-Mei Chen from Drexel University to try to provide input and insight into policymaking. And the idea of our platform, indeed, just as with all of Frontiers, has been to provide useful information into the policymaking process. But we want to make sure we're doing it effectively and that we're providing it in a way that our policymakers can use. We can give them all kinds of things, but if it's not done in the right way at the right time, then we will not be effective in terms of providing input. So we were very, very lucky to have a wonderful group of policymakers who agreed to speak to us. And I'd like to ask for the slide showing the names of our policymakers with whom we spoke. And you will see here our policymakers. I don't want to take too much time to read each of their fantastic careers, but they were very high-level policymakers. Some of them are now working as consultants, but most recently they have been high-level policy advisors to the governments of Canada, Japan, the United States, and the European Commission. And we were very lucky to be able to interview them. I'd like to just summarize what we heard. And then in addition, if anyone would like to have more information about HOPE, we are happy to welcome you to our webpage. So let me go on first and talk a little bit about what we heard from our policymakers, and then directly from them through a video. And then we will also hear from our panelists in terms of their reaction to that. And what I ask our panelists to talk about specifically, address, is the question of how we do better to bridge the evidence base with policymaking. So these are the questions that we asked our policymakers, and as we received their input, we also couldn't help but ask a few additional questions as we went along because they had fascinating insights. But our questions are, as a policymaker, what essential scientific information do you need to be better prepared to make good decisions, particularly in a time of emergency? What is the optimal way to present this information to you? And if you could increase any kind of budget or resource for your policymaking process, what would that be and what would that look like? And what we found is that each of our policymakers acknowledged that it is not just scientific input that informs their decision making. Can we look at the next slide, please? Because this was one of the key points that came out of our policymakers' experiences, and that is that there are actually many players and many voices that have a part in policy making. We know that on the left-hand side, evidence is important, and that's part of what we provide from Frontiers and from the journal and scholarly world. We provide evidence into the process. But in addition, our policymakers must deal with a political agenda that they are in the middle of and often have a lot of pressures from the political side. And then we also have the values that any of our societies and communities bring to the process, as well as the values of science and technology itself. So what we'd like to do now is hear from our policymakers directly. May we have the video, please?
That it is often the case, but it's an understatement of the map to say, in an ideal world, evidence will lead to policy. Actually, there are 3 points on the map. It's a triangle, and you have political preferences, so the von der Leyen agenda, you have evidence, and then you have values. I think that, especially in a democracy, but not only, scientists therefore need to triangulate as they present their evidence to understand what values are underlying the thought patterns of my interlocutors, and what are their stated policy preferences, so that I can either affirm or refine or contradict them. I'm a historian, so I'm not a hard scientist, and I found both dealing with the life sciences as a regulator in the food chain and dealing with the physical sciences as a funder of research in the IT field, it was extremely important to have opposite scientists who deeply understood their subject, but understood how to convey it to non-experts. So there's a linguistic and there is a framing issue. You frame it so that it meets the values and preferences of your listener, and you articulate it in language that the average commissioner, as the first Secretary General of the Commission used to say, a normal commissioner could understand.
In the Japanese context, what is key is that they want to have evidences. For the moment, that is. Because the concept of evidence-based policymaking is imported to Japan from OECD and other European American practices. So we are aligning to this concept, but the interpretation of this is that when we make political decisions, we need to bring some data or background analysis formulated by scientific sphere or even ministries-related research institutions or think tank associated, but something not impression, but in particular numbers, usually metrics. So the preferences is to have background data, in particular metrics, and to bring, to ensure that their arguments are supported by something.
Thank you for that. We are very lucky that our policymakers were willing to talk to us about these very interesting insights that they gave us. So if we could go to the next slide, we'll continue to synthesize what we heard from our policymakers. All right, well, one of the things we heard from all of our policymakers is the important role of their advisors. So the policymakers often had teams of advisors or teams of staff who helped them. In some cases, not enough staff and not enough support. So the role of advising in policymaking was noted by our policymakers as critical to the process. And those advisors oftentimes bring an advocacy role. They're advocating for a particular point of view, and that's perfectly fine. But we have to hear from many kinds of voices. And oftentimes what we need is an advisory structure. We can't just ask for input and have people throw their views in. Many times we need structured advice. And we know that we do have many different kinds of structured advice in the sciences and in policymaking. one of the questions that came up from our policymakers is how do we encourage those advisory processes to be inclusive and also to be more global. So many times we know that in the policy process, we hear from our own national or local interests, and we hear from advocates for a certain area of science, but we also need to make sure that we're finding a way to be inclusive and broader thinking in terms of the global system. So our experts mentioned the role of staff and advisors and the need for that in their processes. May we please go to our experts. May we ask our panelists to comment at this point? Ruth and Remy, Ruth, would you like to go first, please, and comment on these views that we have presented to you?
Thank you very much, Caroline. Lovely to be with you all today. I think one of the things that really comes out is that triangulation and the importance of understanding values and understanding your audience and understanding what is it that's the big issue, and being able to tell a story of the science so that it lands effectively and meaningfully with the person that you're speaking with. And that's something that doesn't happen. It's not something that's you can put into a package. It's something that evolves through dialogue and through relationships. So I think there's something very important about in sort of acknowledging that the change makers are people. They're not, so science is there's evidence, there's data, there's knowledge, but there's also people, and people are the change makers. And that's the same on the policy side as well. And so it's about making sure that there is opportunities and fertile environments and good places for that kind of interaction and dialogue to happen, and evolve and for things to emerge and do in a collective way.
Thank you.
So maybe on that, thank you, Caroline, and thank you, the organizer of the session. Comment I'll make today probably, in a sense, two acts. My act as a Quebec chief scientist, very much involved in the early days of the pandemic, daily with the politician, and then also now as president of the International Network for Empowering Science Advice, so kind of a local to very, very global. And I agree that the triangle is certainly very, very key. That science is one of the key components, but it's one of the key components, not the whole thing. And then decision will be coming from a policymaker and elected official, from politician. And I remember one minister here in Quebec telling me at some point, well, if you want to make the decision, just run for election. And if you're elected, then you make the decision. So I think it's good as well. And we have to learn that as science advisor. That's the one important piece, but one piece. And the key point, I think, for me was learning the language of each other. I think it was mentioned in your report, Caroline. So we speak different language, and I think we have to become familiar as scientists to the language of high-level policymaker and vice versa. So very, very important. And also we have to be very honest, and we saw that very much during the pandemic. In terms of science, what do we know about the science, what we do not know, and then we build on that over time. So more the scientific method than the data of today. So I think that's very important also to be very honest and transparent about the data.
Thank you, Ruth and Remy from the panel. We'll come back to you again in a few. One of the things that both of you emphasized is the role of communication. And indeed, that was something that each of our experts also talked about, both the role of seeking input from the policy makers, from other policymakers, as well as seeking input from the general public and from the scientific community. So if we could go to the slides now, please. we'll see that our policy experts mentioned communication, as Ruth said, and also mentioned the importance of explaining that scientific method that Remy mentioned, the role of evidence and the role of the process of verifying and validating information along the way. And we use a peer-reviewed process, of course, on the Frontiers platform. All of our research is peer-reviewed before it is presented. And so we know that these are some of the aspects of the process that our policymakers really truly value. Anne Glover, one of our policymakers with whom we spoke, talked about her role as the chief scientific advisor for the European Commission. And she talked about the fact that in order to be useful to government, they have to prepare and have support for the roles of these advisors. So scientific advisors can't be just talking heads, shouting into the process. They need actually a function. They have to be able to work within that kind of the institutional culture with which they are working, but also have that culture value the input of the scientific process. And one of the things that she noted in her experience is that the process of providing the advice has to be able to acknowledge that there's uncertainty in how we understand the world. Science is continually renewing our understanding of the world with new findings, which is a wonderful thing. But sometimes, because there is uncertainty, policymakers can be a little bit uncomfortable with the inputs. So one of the things we need to be able to explain, again, as Remy mentioned, is that scientific process, the uncertainty, and the validity, both of which are built into the scientific process itself. So can we please go to the next slide? In my own research on what happened during the pandemic, I found that that the scientific world and the policy world ran kind of towards the most elite voices. That one of the things we found is that in a crisis, people tend to go to a few experts and a few institutions, partly because of reputation and the need for that kind of certainty that I think Anne talked about in her presentation to us when we talked about this through the Hope Project, that there is uncertainty, and each of our inputs will at different times be uncertain to a particular level. And so a lot of times what we do then is we look for that one voice, that expert. In COVID, it worked to some extent, especially at the beginning, but we saw over time that the need for inclusive voices became more and more important. And yet the process is very much set up to hear from experts and people with special degrees and awards and things like that. And so one of the things that I think came out of our process was the need to be able to communicate and to bring in many voices. Probably the best way to do that is through our advisory functions that we have in most of the advanced countries' governments. Do we have another slide or a video? Okay. Thank you.
The strategy for me and response for me does not come from planning. It comes from conversation. And so the classical planning paradigms are often wrong because there isn't enough information to plan, but there is enough information to frame and to organize how one could respond. And that to me is the difference. And we can see that in different countries, the way they responded to COVID. Some people had an engaged conversational approach. I think they did better. Some people trusted the experts, but the experts couldn't explain it properly. And you get a disconnect opening up, and distrust in expertise, can be a great risk in these conversations. And I think that the fundamental elements that are really, really important is to make sure that scientists can say and learn to articulate in the language that they work in, whichever spoken language it is, a simpler view of the reality that is not very often. When I was running an organization once, I banned the phrase dumbing things down. Scientists often talk about dumbing things down. And I said, that's a cop-out. What it means is that you think that you're smarter than other people because you're using the word dumb. And that's a fatal mistake. So this is not dumbing things down. This is making it audience appropriate, articulating an audience appropriate message to them about what you are doing.
I mean, it helps to have an infrastructure within your various decision-making organizations, that you can tap into, right? I mean, there's a reason that the INCSA exists, for example, the International Network for Government Science Advice. There was a felt need to try to provide more structure to the way in which advice and expertise is brought into the decision-making, systems around the world. The pandemic has shown that you can get your act together, right? On a pretty serious global issue, when the need arises. And so I would hope there's some lessons learned from that on both sides, from the decision-making community, policymakers, but also from the research knowledge community. Hey, let's wake up and get our act together in a much more strategic way and communicate it in a very effective way with the tools that we have, not just through our publications, but through our, storytelling capabilities and our outreach tools that we have. And we have many of those.
Thank you. We just heard from Dr. Adrian Patterson from Australia and Dr. Paul Dufour from Canada. And both of them provided very interesting insights into the communications process, how best to not just rush to the experts, as Dr. Patterson said, but to have a more conversational approach, but also to make sure that that conversation and inclusion is actually structured in a way that it can provide input at the right time and in the most appropriate way. May we have the slides, please? So we heard from our experts that good practices include a number of factors. So we can see on the left here that balls of science go into the decision-making process, right? We have scientific input at different levels, as we know. Some very well validated and verified, others tentative and interim findings that go into this decision-making process. And then we have all of the different aspects that we talked about in the triangle. We have the political agenda, and we have values of the community, and values of the scientific process as well. So we know that we want evidence-informed decisions. So many times, even in my own experience of providing advice to the US White House and the US Congress, I was shocked when maybe science didn't necessarily carry the day. There are other parts of the process that are involved. And so we need evidence-informed decisions, a point that was noted particularly by Dr. Harayama from Japan. We need to be able to explain the provisional and interim nature of some of these inputs, a point that was made in particular by Dr. Glover in her comments. We also have to have some kinds of metrics along the way. We have to be able to measure in some way some aspects of what we are examining. We need to know how well they're working, and we need to have, again, we have, even within the social sciences, need evidence in order to convince our policymakers of the validity of the points that we're making. And we also need to both understand levels of uncertainty. So scientists need to be able to present that information to policymakers, and policymakers need to be able to explain that also to those with whom they are speaking and advising. So all of these different aspects go into that good decision making and that process. And in a pandemic or a crisis of some kind, all of this needs to speed up. And so there does need to be those good communication processes that our experts talked about. So may we please go to the next videos. From our next experts, we'll hear about the fact that the process itself has been moved a bit or added onto at the global level. So we know that we have local interactions, we have national and regional interactions, and in addition, now we have this global, and we saw this very much during the COVID crisis, where we really needed information from around the globe at a very rapid pace. So thank you.
We're way beyond this. We're way beyond that. We are in a time of a global science and technology enterprise. That's a given. And I think it's something, that has been around for a while, and I think it's going to go on. I think the real, question is, it's always a balancing act between cooperation and competition. And those two elements are going to be in the world forever, because this is the way we're built at this time. Openness in science, where you share all of the data and you share all of the information, and you make sure that the exchanges are equal, you make sure that there's transparency. Those are the values of science, and I think it's really why it's such an excellent international tool for building relationships, because it's not really one country that believes that. I think most countries believe this, all scientists believe this. And so I think it's just a diplomatic issue where it has to be taken on, and it has to be taken on repeatedly. And in some years it's in a better place, in other years it's not. And it is often influenced by the broader bilateral relationship.
What we have seen during the COVID crisis, we have seen science in real time, where scientists were discovering things about the virus and were fighting between themselves with different interpretations. And at the end, the last word was given to the policymakers, who had to make a decision on lockdown, opening frontiers or whatever, with different things on wearing masks and ventilation and all this. So I think, we can't afford having this kind of cacophony in crisis times. You need a structure where the scientists are able to disagree and get with a position which is sellable to the politicians, and explain. So I find that, it cannot be, there's no ideal word for this, but at least that there are some areas where IPCC type of structures established on a continuous basis would be extremely helpful in managing crisis times, and maybe in prevention as well. Trying to build the relationship with fora like the G7, like the G20, identifying in their conclusions where there's really a political commitment on which they could build, and to work with the presidency of these groups or UN or agencies or all these groups to create the scientific structure and get the funding for the scientific structure, I think is quite important.
Yes, we heard from our two policymakers there about both the input of the scientific process as well as the nature of that world, the science world, being based on openness, reciprocity, and transparency, and the need to continue that as part of how we do science and provide that to the policymaking process. May we see the slides, please? And so I'd like to ask our panelists to comment, if you would, Ruth and Remy.
Yep, I don't know if Ruth is still okay. Yeah, you want to go ahead, Ruth? Then okay, so maybe just a few comments here, and maybe I'll start again back to Anne Glover in a sense, and with Anne Butcher at the end. Basically, I think the message there is that you cannot set up this type of structure during emergency. You have to have some of these structures established long before and adequately supported, adequately financed by government at the local, global, or national level, a bit like the IPPC type of model, if you want it to work. I think, Caroline, one of your comments was one voice, and certainly as a, for example, CSA in Quebec, and maybe was one voice, but critically important is that you consult with colleagues all over in Canada or globally to bring that to your advice to your government. Very, very important. I think the last point I'll make here now is what we saw also during the pandemic, very global, open science, exchanging, science diplomacy, what we call science diplomacy, is making inroad, and at the moment even the European Union is now asking colleagues in Brussels to take on a strategy in terms of science policy and science diplomacy.
Ruth, would you like to join?
Thank you. I think probably picking up on that diplomacy aspect is quite interesting, because my understanding of that role is it's very conversational. It's building relationships. It's sitting alongside. It's experiencing together. And I think if you think about what a conversation is, and I think that was very much brought out in one of the parts of the video, the importance of a conversation. And if you think about a conversation, you generally don't know where it's going to finish when you start, so it's open-ended. People are coming into that conversation with an open mind. It's dynamic, so it's responsive. It's not just one person talking. It's each voice having a part in that conversation and reflecting and engaging with the other. It's often it's often the most effective when there are diverse parts of that conversation. So a conversation with 2 people or 3 people or 4 people takes on a very, very different capability, I suppose. So I wonder if there's some really interesting insights there into how conversations actually get us to places that we might not have thought we might get to in the first place, and how we can instill that into that diplomacy between science and policymakers. And I think the tricky thing about that is it's something that we can't do quickly. It's something that has to be built over time. Relationships take time. And so there's something quite profound there, I think, about this ongoing nature of the interaction between science and policy, and how we enable that, and how we make sure that it's not just, particular voices, that we do actually ensure that there is that that diversity, whether that's geographical or whether it's stage in career, whether there are lots and lots of different aspects to that. But I think this idea of conversations is a really powerful one, and one that we can all relate to, because we're all profoundly conversational, with profoundly humanity is about sharing and telling stories, and I think that there's some real mileage there.
Wonderful. Thanks for those great comments. And I'm also reminded of one of our experts also who said that the process is always one of cooperation and competition, right? Competition to have our voice heard, but also the need to cooperate and find ways to provide input, which was all about what our panel has been focusing on, and our process project as well, HOPE, has been about finding the most efficient, effective, and equitable way to provide input to the policymaking process. So finally, I think we just want to start off our question and answer period by noting on our final slide where we hope to go next with our HOPE project. So if we could just show where we hope to go. We know that these are global challenges. We're moving really out of the pandemic into the climate crisis. One of the things we found when we looked at the pandemic, COVID pandemic, is that almost immediately journals, societies, and scientific groups made their research open and available. Nearly 100% of scientific research provided during the pandemic related to COVID was open access, even on subscription journals that are very elite and tend to cost a great deal of money to subscribe to. But these journals made COVID materials freely available on their website in order to enable rapid response to the crisis. This may be something worth looking into as a community going forward, both from the policymaking side as well as from the scientific and scholarly publishing side, because we have a number of different aspects that we need to consider. And we put some of those on this slide, but we want to ask our audience now if you have thought of some items that you want to add in, comment upon, emphasize. So could we please go to our discussion forum for some comments? Is Mama Getty able to join at this time? I don't know if she's available. I don't see. Okay, all right, very good. Do we have some questions in the chat?
Indeed, and so first of all, thanks to you and to the panelists for this first exchange of ideas. We have a few questions relating to how can we more incentivize the political system to be more openly willing, or to be more willing, not openly, to be willing to take on board scientific evidence. So what are the incentives, the small changes that we can that we can do, that we can propose in order to speed that process up or to optimize that process? That's the first question.
Ask our panelists to address that. Ruth, why don't you start?
Thank you. I think that's a really insightful question. And it definitely plays into this idea of this being a very two-way situation. I think there's something about being able to show, not always just tell. And I think as scientists, we need to be demonstrating how we can be available and able to offer insights that are useful. And that comes down to storytelling. I think it also comes into play here that the opportunities that there are to rub shoulders and to have those open-ended discussions, so that actually science becomes infused in the view of a particular issue, whether that's from the public or whether that's policymakers. And obviously those two audiences are quite key here, because policymakers are very much in tune with the public, and so things that the public care about and things that the public are aware of will feed into what's on the radar within policy. So I don't know if that's a very specific answer, but I do think building in more and more opportunities for these different voices to come together and to do that in ways that aren't necessarily problem focused, that they are a little bit more general, they're more cultural. So to generating a culture where there is conversation and dialogue between different parts of that ecosystem, I think would have a valuable output, because scientific ways of thinking and what science can do and what it can offer would be more likely to be at the fingertips of those who are horizon scanning and tasked with making some of the most difficult decisions that there are. Remy, do you want to?
Maybe just to continue on that, and of course the pandemic had a lot of very bad side to it from society globally. But maybe one good thing is that we have rubbed shoulder more, a lot of scientists all over the world with policymakers. Of course, it was not perfect, and we made mistakes, but they know us a bit more now. And for me, even in Canada, having groups that contacted us and said, "Oh, we didn't actually knew that you existed, but we'd like to work with you in the future." So I think that's rubbing shoulder. I think it's a good side doing, and also trying now to say, hey, maybe we could help, not necessarily me as an expert, but maybe we could help with it in relation with climate change. That will be for a long run. It's not just a short term. Of course, the pandemic was long, but climate change was there for quite a few years. So maybe science advice could be helpful there, and how we can help policymakers and elected officials. I think on that side, I'm optimistic that scientists all over the world are very, very much involved, and now it's about finding a way to make sure that people will continue to be engaged on both sides.
Yeah, thank you. And if we can go on this, what COVID also showed us is that when there was a real panic in the beginning, at least in this part of the world, it was only the scientists who were hurt, because it was a new thing, knew how to make sense out of it, and it was only scientists that you saw in the media speaking up and so on. But the more the pandemic became normalized, meaning knowing what the boundaries are, the less they were actually dominating the discussion. And that, I think, and that's actually my question related to this one to both of you, is that the mistake that I think that has been made then is that the scientific method of thinking, namely you question each other, is it really so difficult? Is it really so dangerous? Are the vaccines working? Was a discussion that was made public. And I think that shouldn't have happened. And this is also what Anne Boucher said, the Director General of Santé. It was a cacophony of opinions that we got. Can I ask your reaction on that?
Yeah, it's true. But I think here, one thing that probably we have to do better as a scientist and science advisor is to explain a bit more the scientific methods, and overall, policymakers often are not very much aware of that, and the public. So I think we have to work more with the public and about the scientific method, and it's not necessarily the data of the day on the first page of the New York Times that necessarily is true. So it's a process. I think we have to explain that a little bit, and scientific literacy is critical. We need to make sure that the society from primary school to old aging nursing home hear about science, progress of science, and otherwise we'll continue to fight fake news, and that's very harmful to society.
Okay. Ruud, you wanted to join in?
Yeah, I think one of the really interesting things about this is that science does have a particular persona, particularly within general society. I think science is often looked to as being able to provide a definitive answer very, very quickly, very, very clearly, because it's able to distill something that's very complex into something very sort of quote unquote simple. And actually, what I've observed certainly in the last few months is that there's been a realization that of what science can do and what it can't do. So this idea that science is inherently provisional, and that as more data comes to light, the understanding of what the data or the insights that we've been able to get from science, that might change as more information comes to light. And so I think in some ways it's been a real challenge, but I would, again, from an optimistic point of view, there's potential here for going forward there to be a much more engagement with science as this pioneer to discover, but also doing so in a way that is consistent with a very complex world, with the increasingly complex challenges that we're seeing at the global scale, with what it can offer, and potentially what questions are being asked of science that aren't actually reasonable because of the way science works and what science can do. So there's something quite interesting there, I think, about how we teach science, as you say, Remy, from primary school all the way upwards, to transition from this binary approach, I think, where data provides clarity, and actually a willingness to become more content with this idea that the more we can see and the more that we know and the more data we can get on something, actually the more complex potentially that situation becomes. And the really interesting thing is, how do we navigate that? How do we ensure that there's transparency in terms of the fact that there are different interpretations as to what the data might be telling us? And how does that then get us a step forward in making the world a better place for everybody, and not just in one direction or another? So there's something there about our culture, I suppose, in terms of where are we going, and what sort of part do we want science to have in that? And I think it has changed as a result of COVID, for sure.
Maybe if I can add just a little bit here. I think also we have to work, and it's not necessarily just the pandemic there before, but also with the media. But of course, the traditional aspect is more to have a member of government that will say yes, and then the opposition will say no. And of course, still a bit the same model when you talk in the media about science. So you have someone that say yes, climate change does exist, and then we need to find an opponent. Should not work that way, but there are things for us as scientists to work on that in science and environment. So you don't have again that binary structure.
Indeed, and related to that is a question that we got is from someone asking us that they are curious on our thoughts on how to communicate these nuances and uncertainties that are inherent in the scientific process and the outcomes, how to communicate that to policymakers. And I'm very curious to hear what you think about it, because my experience is that if you can't synthesize it in 3 slides, you're getting into a big difficulty to communicate your message. I'm making a caricature of it, but so how to translate these subtleties, because that needs more than scientific literacy, I think. Maybe you start now, and then we give Anna, Ruud, your time to start first now. Sorry.
I think that's a really very valuable insight, isn't it? Because you often do have 30 seconds to land a point with a very busy person with an increasingly chaotic schedule of multiple competing challenges and issues on their plate. So I think there is a way to distill something into a very clear and pithy message that is going to land with that triangulation in terms of the political agenda and the values of the person that you're engaging with, but to also be able to nuance it and to provide an insight that is potentially your opinion on the basis of what you can see and what you have engaged with and synthesized, but also to potentially offer the alternative viewpoint or approach. And I guess that's something that is quite an interesting thing. If we think about how science progresses, it's often through disagreement. It is often through alternative competing hypotheses and testing them. And actually, when you find something that doesn't stack up with the way that you had been approaching something, that's often where innovation and breakthroughs happen. So I guess it's embracing our scientific method in terms of the disparate views that could be brought to bear on a particular aspect. But then it's a really amazing skill. When people have it, it's amazing. But I don't think it's an easy one to get. But if you can then distill that, not only your idea, but also the nuance of that, that's when I think potentially we're in a position where we're actually able to really help those who are tasked with those big decisions. Remy.
Maybe I'll add here, and that certainly will not be satisfactory. But what I mentioned in the beginning, transparency, certainly very important, what we know, what we don't know. But also, and very, very important, some type of system need to be in place before you are in crisis like the one we lived through over the past 2 years. So when you go and talk with a very high level policymaker or with elected official like Premier or Prime Minister, they have to have trust in you. You have to know each other. If you don't really have that trust, you'll be extremely challenging. So sometimes you say, well, I'm not so sure about that, it's A and B. But if they know you and they trust you, it'll be much easier for them to come up with some kind of solution. But you cannot develop that overnight. Of course, it takes time.
Yeah, we should have a little bit what we have in economics. So although not everyone knows the details, we do know that if the inflation goes this and the deflation goes there, we have a problem and that we should do something. So you don't need to explain with a treaty of 300 pages all the subtleties for policy to pick it up. And that is, I think, what we miss in a lot of our crises, is this kind of red line thinking, okay, we trust the science, now we know that we have to act. And that brings us back to this discussion what we had. How can we structure this? How can we embed it in our policy thinking? Because a continuous stream, this is also one of the questions, a continuous stream of scientific advice is not doing the job in that respect. We have to target it and to embed it much better.
Also, just defining that line between the science of what we know and what has to be researched. So we always have this balance as well between the established science and the things that we don't know. Science knows a lot of things that, in addition, in time of crisis, we also have to conduct research in order to learn what new information presents to us. Yeah. And I think that gets to one of the questions there about how we explain uncertainty. I think policymakers are usually pretty good on understanding uncertainty. The question is, how do we present that to a broader public? Do you have comments on that, panelists, about the broader public and the story to the media?
I think one of the things from that is where people's thresholds for risk. And I guess COVID has shown us one lens on that. The stakes are very, very high, still are very high. Where is that threshold of risk, and what are we comfortable with in a particular scenario? In other situations, that threshold to risk might be a bit different. But I suppose what part of that idea about being very clear about what we do know and what we don't know, but what could we know with a bit more time is part of that conversation, isn't it? I know I keep coming back to that, but there seems to be something quite profound about this ongoing. So having scientists at the table rather than on tap, as people have said in the past, it's infusing science over time so that actually you can make wise decisions that bring all those things into play. But Remy, I'm sure you've got more insight.
Important question, and probably will take a bit of time. But again, coming back to the scientific methods and probably a bit more participatory science, or you can call it citizen science. And again, working with our citizen, our fellow citizen. I think it's very important. It's difficult sometimes. It can be time consuming, and many scientists may not want to do that. But I think especially the younger generation, they are quite open about that. And if we think about climate change, I think there we need to do that. We need to find better ways to try to tell to everyone, or everyone in our society, what is the impact of climate change on, in a sense, on me, on my family, on my street. If it's something from global government, sometimes public will feel a bit of distance with that, but I think more and more the message needs to be very strong with the public on the ground, with the citizen, and if citizens are fully committed, elected officials, politicians will have basically no choice to take stronger action. But I think the scientists need to maybe get a bit dirty there and get on the ground outside of their lab and talking to the fellow citizens.
Indeed. And by the way, we are working on a proposition there to get more scientists into the policy, but that's for later. We still have time. I would last question and then to wind up by Caroline. So the question, I think it's a very good question also that asks us, how do we prevent the cherry picking of bad science in the evidence-informed policy process? One example here is, which the person from the question says us, is I'm thinking of the banning of BPA in Canada, where the anti-BPA advocates used studies that were poor quality to successfully promote their position in the regulatory process. I have no idea what BPA is. I think it is something with modified organisms, I assume, but Remy, since the example came from Canada, I assume you know what it is. Mike.
I do happen to know this. BPA is an additive to plastics that can be a poison. Yeah.
Yeah, I think.
Okay, but the question is how to avoid cherry picking bad science.
It's a very good question too, and not so easy. And of course, there is a lobbyists that will talk with high-level policymaker, with elected official all the time. And of course, as a scientist, as a chief scientist advisor, you should not come a lobbyist for one side versus the other. You have to look at the data, not always easy. And of course, often people government tell you, well, I heard about this, what do you think? So I think we have to stick to the data. But of course, some group will try to push for their own, and we saw that with petroleum, we saw that with cigarettes, we saw that. So there's many, but we have to stick with the data. I think not easy. Good.
No. Good.
Oh yeah, I think it's a really big challenge, and I think it's often only with hindsight that it's possible to identify what is not good quality science. So that there's something here about the idea that if we're transparent in terms of what the science insights are and the diversity of considerations within the science community, that it becomes more possible to have disagreements and for there to be a development of discernment between competing opinions, and I think that also potentially creates stronger approaches for demonstrating the validity of the opinion that is being presented, and that can then be weighed up. But I don't think there's an easy answer, and I think it probably does change depending on particular issues. But generally speaking, I think if we're able to hold multiple views on the science together and to be able to test them, which requires quite a lot of nuance and a fair bit of discernment, that potentially gets us a little bit further forward in terms of identifying what is justifiable and robust and reproducible, and what isn't.
Yeah, indeed. And I think, because I would suggest to slowly wind it up, we can go over time, but I'm afraid we will lose people there. But to wind it up, I think that we have to accept that science and policy are two different cultures, two different ways of thinking, but that doesn't mean bridges. And in our discussions, in our interviews, we have seen that there are many bridges, and probably the best bridge is to, not invite the people at the table and not put them on the tap, so that it becomes a culture, the exchange between the scientists and the policymakers. So, Caroline, I hand over for you for the closing comments and winding up the session.
Yes, I want to thank our panelists here, Ruth Morgan and Remy Kirian, for providing us their expert input. I want to thank our policymakers who we interviewed during the course of this project: Robert Madeline, Yuko Harayama, Adrian Patterson, Paul Dufour, Carrie Ann Jones, Ann Glover, and Ann Boucher, who provided really wonderful insights into the process. I think one of the things we perhaps take away is that many of us from the scientific side of things wish, well, gee, if everybody would just believe the science, then we'd all be okay. But in fact, we have to join into a process of conversation and discussion in a way that will inform the process and hopefully also enlighten the process of making good decisions. We are also hoping that everyone watching will join our discussion as well at Policy Labs. If we could put up the slide with the information about how to contact Policy Labs, you will be able to see how you can join in this conversation. Please send comments, thoughts, questions, ideas to this group here. You can see that Policy Lab at frontiers.org will be the place to join in the conversation. In addition, we put up some emails of different participants. If you would like to respond to one of us individually, we'd be glad to take that back to the larger project. I want to thank the conference organizers for inviting our panel here today, and wish the very best to the Canadian Science Policy Conference as they continue on their very important work of examining the questions of science policy and decision making. And with that, I'll thank our panel, our staff, and our policymakers who joined us again. And I'm Caroline Wagner, Ohio State University, and thank you very much.